Look, the thing is, artists aren't normal people. The great artists of the 20th century are deeply eccentric weirdos. The compulsion to express is something that you are either born with or you're not. I think that you have to learn how to communicate effectively, and you also have to figure out what you can do that might be useful, that might be of value to other people. And it's like, really? You? Like, you've never done anything. And if you don't have that, then your life will be a waking nightmare.
Hi, Samuel.
Hi,
Such a
Daniel.
pleasure to see
How are
you.
you? Likewise.
Good.
I was just listening to you playing Foray. Very nice.
Oh,
Very beautiful.
yeah.
Now, that's not a contemporary sound, eh? That's a different approach to playing the violin that I don't hear very often. I like it very much.
Well, it depends what you mean by contemporary, but definitely my musical DNA goes back further than 1950. You played some violin, I read, in your past life, yes?
Well, I started on violin when I was, I don't remember, 5 or 6 years old. And then I switched to cello. I played cello for quite a few years. And then when I moved to, before I moved to France, I switched to oboe. And then oboe
Hmm.
became my main professional instrument for about 15 years. And then finally I had to give up playing in order to, I tried to balance composing and performance for a long time and did not succeed. So composing won out in the end.
Yeah. Well, at the same time, I know you've talked about, how these days a composer should try to be their own champion in that sense of, performing your own works. And I guess we'll chat about that.
So why did you decide to start a podcast, and who is it directed towards?
There isn't enough of people who are kind of deep in their particular domain, and also we'll have conversations about it. It's typically like you have to become a professional podcaster or something, and then you're not doing the thing as much anymore. And
Yeah, most of the big podcasts are 95% about politics. And so that's one of the reasons that I wanted to go on some of those shows, actually, because they never talk about the arts. I've ended up um, on those shows simply because they are programs that I think are moving the needle of the culture, and a lot of
sure.
people are listening to them, and they talk about a broad variety of things that really concern people, and the arts is typically not among those subjects. So basically, I've crashed the party, and I've tried to uh, insert my own concerns into that sphere.
So you're in Paris, yeah?
No, not at all. No, I'm presently in
Oh,
Germany.
oh,
I lived in Paris for 10 years, and then my wife couldn't
oh,
stand it
okay.
there anymore, and so we decided to move out east to Alsace, and we ended up settling about 2 kilometers from the border with Germany. And then, for varying reasons, I decided to take a studio across the border. So this is where I come to work every day. It's just inside the German border. And then
Hmm.
I do my work day here, and then I return to France. So that's my life.
Alsace is a little bit of a fairy tale kind of town, yes?
It's got that aspect to it. When you go into the villages, it's all these half-timbered houses, and they're meticulously kept up. And most of the region was spared during the World Wars. Well, it was under German control in both instances, but it wasn't heavily bombarded at all.
Mm.
So the towns are beautifully preserved. Yeah, no, it's very nice. The only problematic aspect of it is the weather, which is among the worst in the world. I'm from Ontario originally, a small town in Ontario, and it gets cold there, but I don't consider cold in and of itself to be bad weather.
Sure.
The Alsatian thing, the problem here is that you get these masses of either very hot or very cold, humid air that just sit there for 6 months at a time. And then during the winter months, it's overcast for 6 months out of the year. So you have these opaque white skies. And I'm kind of getting into it, actually. It takes the edge off things, I suppose. It sort of attenuates. It's like compression in audio. It
Mm.
attenuates the gap between high energy signals and low energy signals. Everything's just kind of flat.
For a while, I was going back and forth about do I need to be surrounded by beauty or ugliness to do my best work, and it was not immediately clear to me what is kind of a better environment for music and art
Yeah.
and creativity?
Yeah. It's that's a complicated question. I had a long discussion about that actually with a friend of mine a couple of weeks ago who's Italian, and he's like all Italians, he's a total snob about food and about architecture. His attitude about that is that, if you're born in the most beautiful place in the world that has the most developed cuisine of anywhere in Europe, then everything else is an insult to you. It's like you go to Germany, for example, or Switzerland, and you can barely stand being alive because it's so much worse in comparison to the culture that you're born into. And so we were walking through the streets of this little town in Germany where I spend most of my time. And it's a kind of a typical post-war German town where there's no real historical city center anymore. There's a few historic buildings, but mostly it was built in the 50s and beyond. And it's not particularly charming. I find this place unbelievably fascinating and stimulating, and I love being here. It's not beautiful though. And he was talking about that. He pointed to a building and said, if I had to see that every day, it would crush my soul. And I kind of understand where he's coming from, but I don't have that at all because I'm from Toronto, and Toronto is not beautiful.
I haven't had the pleasure yet.
I hope you don't.
No, that there's so much pulling me there, and all the Glenn Gould stuff. I mean, I need to go there, do the pilgrimage.
Yeah, I mean, Gould was an important character in my formation. Yeah, he was far and away the most important Canadian composer, or not, sorry, most important Canadian performer.
It's a
That
Freudian slip there.
well, he did compose too, but his compositions are not on the same level as his performances.
Well, he might say he was part composer in those performances as well, but
A lot of performers pursue composition as a kind of violon d'ingres. It's a kind of a second thing that they pursue. Being a performer doesn't necessarily equip you to be a composer, and vice versa, right? They're somewhat overlapping but distinct skill sets. And Gould seems to have been convinced in the earlier part of his career that he had things to say through composition. Unfortunately, he didn't, and or else he didn't have the patience to sit there and actually work through the inevitable musical problems that one has to deal with in forming a musical language, a musical style. So the pieces that I've heard are a mix between unfinished student works, which are, they're decent student pieces, but they're not much more than that. And then there are no mature works to speak of except this interminable string quartet in F minor that
yes.
that is far too long and dull and badly written and so on. Nevertheless, people persist in playing it because it's written by Glenn Gould.
Do they? I'm yet to hear a performance. But then there's
It might
so
be
you
the
want to
same
write a
string
fugue
quartet that
also.
plays it every time. So you want to write a fugue is a novelty piece. It's not really a composition. It's very
Right.
cute though.
Well, yeah, I'm wondering, like, how is it that someone so gifted with an understanding of music and an ability to create it and think about it and speak about it and just like essentially all of this, such a complete package of let's call it genius, just can't write a tune, so to speak, and can't, and that it's such a different skill. I mean, Nadia Boulanger being another example, like not the most amazing writing, but this incredible understanding. It's like, what is it that gives a composer that potential, that raw potential to just like create a melody? It seems it has nothing to do with understanding music per se.
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know. What I can say is, in my own experience, it manifests as a compulsion. And there are things that you are, if I want to be
Perhaps a kink.
sort of, yeah, perhaps, yeah. I was going to use somewhat more highfalutin language than that, but no, it's something that if you want to be metaphysical about it, you are given to say, and it's like there are things that manifest as essential for you to express, and if you don't do it, then it crushes you. It's like you have to get it out somehow, and it's a kind of an unformed mass of potential, something like that you have to chip away at and sculpt and turn into something. Because if you don't do that, if you don't go through that rigorous process, then you won't be able to articulate your ideas. The compulsion to express, I believe, is something that you are either born with or you're not. Now, it can take many forms. I mean, Glenn Gould was obviously, hugely creative. There's no question about that. But he didn't channel that into musical composition, or at least that wasn't the specific form in which his gift manifested itself.
Yeah, I mean, some people are good editors and some people are good writers also. It's kind of like I feel like I'm not a very good composer, although I haven't, spent a lot of time doing it. But I don't feel in my soul that this is like something that would produce much fruit. But yet, if I'm given something, I can start toying with it. That I feel much more comfortable with, in some sense. I don't know if that's like a personality thing or a.
Well, I'm tempted to say, in the case of Gould and others too, that part of it is that the creative faculty is you have to be a complete person, I think, in order to exercise it. This is a remark of Stravinsky's and or Bob Kraft's. It's actually not clear because it's from one of those
Okay.
conversation books. But Stravinsky is quoted as having said that he's asked by Robert Kraft, what is technique to you? And Stravinsky says technique is the whole man. And I always think about that quote. I think it's quite insightful, actually, because it implies that you have to bring your entire being, all the different rooms in your psyche to bear upon that enterprise, and you can't hold anything back. It has to all be in there. And when I look at Gould's creative output, there is something very, of the nature of the sort of person stuck in adolescence. It's like he never got beyond that stage. And there are dimensions of that in his own life as well. You can see, if you read his biography, that this is maybe a funny thing to say about someone like that, but in a sense, he never became an adult. He was sort of the eternal adolescent stuck in his parents' bedroom practicing. And I think if you don't get beyond that stage, it's very, very difficult creatively. And also, like if you look at the pieces, they're all pastiches. They're all written in the style of other people, and that's what you would expect from a beginner or from a student. But at a certain point, you have to take on the reins of adulthood and forge your own personality and leave all of that behind. So he didn't get there.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me how these two paths can be so separate, almost not touching one another. That you could really, in a silo, be let's say, among the greatest interpreters ever, and among the worst composers of all time.
I don't know. There are definitely composers worse than him.
This is true. Yeah.
Saint-Saëns, for example. Sorry, I didn't say that.
I was just teaching his third violin concerto recently. You can hum it.
Yeah, yeah, no, I'm being catty. We had an extreme example of that in Toronto about 15 years ago. We had a mayor called Rob Ford, which he got into the international papers
Oh
for a
yeah,
couple of years.
of course, I remember that. That was a really
Yeah,
fun
he was
time.
he was Toronto's like crack smoking mayor, right? Which was a lot of great publicity for the city of Toronto. But here's a guy who's acceded to the highest office in one of the biggest cities in North America. His life is a total train wreck, a total catastrophe. It's like how can you be the mayor and be a wife abusing alcoholic crack addict at the same time? It's so bizarre. People can have their psyches sort of split into multiple parts that don't talk with each other. It does happen.
I guess in some ways that's an optimistic message that maybe we can forgive people for certain things. Who knows?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that's true.
I was wondering if you could share a bit about your origin story, maybe some decisive moments that you think define your DNA as a composer, as a thinker, as an artist.
My origin story is something that I've been trying to piece together myself for quite some time because it's a bit of an unusual one, I suppose. I think part of it is that I was obviously hugely creative when I was a kid, and that was something that took many different forms, and it was totally compulsive and totally unstoppable, and it got in the way of almost every other aspect of my life. So I had a lot of difficulty in school, for example, because it was hard for me. I found it just extremely boring. It was hard for me to focus on the sort of math and history and geography lessons that we were being given, and I was compelled, beyond my ability to refuse, to explore a variety of different creative avenues. And that was the case certainly since the time I was 6 years old. for sure. And I created this whole sort of this rich inner world, but it was also something that made sort of the practicalities of day-to-day life very complicated. And I think that's quite common with creative people. In terms of decisive moments, it's hard to think of any in particular because there were just so many experiences. But I eventually fell into a community of artists in Toronto when I was a teenager. And I was a lot younger than all the rest of them. So I was probably about 15 when this started, when I started meeting a variety of musicians, composers, poets, painters, and started hanging out with them. And that was very, very important to my development, for sure, for all sorts of reasons. And I learned a lot of important lessons about what it means or what it could mean to be an artist from those people. And I think a lot of the attitudes that they harbored sort of definitely made a mark on my psyche. I was an impossible student because I already had all kinds of ideas that were basically already fully formed about what I wanted to do. And that also made it harder, because when you're like that, it's harder for you to learn. It's harder for you to have the humility to learn from your teachers, which I did do, but I could probably have done more of. I have the sensation that really my attitudes towards art were probably shaped quite a lot more by the painters and poets, photographers, and so on that I knew at that time than by my professional training as a musician. Although the professional training also obviously was important in terms of shaping my musical outlook. But
So it seems like you're very good at, or it comes natural to you to take abstract concepts and integrate them into, your musical life and composition, because, taking things from poets and painters, as opposed to primarily studying the work of other composers and, learning by copying maybe, or that just staying in those lanes.
well, all artists do that to a degree. The question is more, do you do it consciously or not? And it's
Right.
probably better to do it consciously because then at least you'll know that you're borrowing this or transforming this from somebody else's practice. Whereas the people who do it unconsciously labor under the illusion that what they're doing is earth-shatteringly original, when in fact usually it's their secondhand, half-digested impressions of things that were already done by other people.
It's their pathology playing out for all of us in real time.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah,
So,
or at least their stubborn ignorance.
I mean, there's a lot of that in the performing world. I mean, there's this kind of posturing that, like, oh, I don't need to listen to recordings and, like, I'm going to do my unique thing. It's like, okay, fair enough, but to pretend that you're not that the way that you scratch this cat gut or whatever with this horsehair is somehow like you've invented your one way of doing it, and that you're independent and you don't want to kind of admit that you have influences and something has influenced you. Like this whole posture is, I think, kind of toxic, and it teaches students to ignore the archive.
We're all guilty of that to some degree. I mean, to a degree, it's a necessary step because being an artist involves the suspension of disbelief, right? It involves the convincing yourself that, this great pantheon of artists that preceded you, that you might actually be the person to put the next brick in that edifice. And it's like, really, you? Like you've never done anything, and you're gonna lay a claim to the same profession as Bach and Beethoven and Haydn. Really. So on some level, you have to have the self-belief to
Yeah.
do that, right? Because otherwise you'd just be completely overwhelmed and you'd never start or do anything.
But it seems like the people that, in my experience, posture that are the ones with the least to say. My greatest teachers were dead people on recordings, I would say.
Yeah.
It's just what it is. And I feel like I don't know about you, I'm living in constant full self-confidence and full self-doubt, kind of in superposition at all times.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that have shaped my response to that kind of thing, that kind of phenomenon that you're describing. The first is that I'm guilty of it myself. So I was for sure not the greatest student. And partly because of, as I mentioned earlier, the tendency to show up with ideas already formed about how I wanted to do things. And then secondly, I'm also a teacher myself. I devote 10 to 15 hours a week to teaching, and I teach people in an amazingly broad range of circumstances. That's one of the advantages of teaching online, is you can work with anybody. anybody who, who wants to work with you, basically. And you have to give people a wide berth, because one of the things that teaching has shown me is that, with some of my students, I'll work with them for a period of years, and you cannot predict the trajectory that these people will have. And sometimes it's amazing what happens. Someone will come to you and they'll be really shy and completely inarticulate, and they can barely write 2 bars of a piece. And then, and you stick with them for a while, and 3 years later, they blossom into a creator that has really distinctive, interesting ideas and is fully armed with the technique they need to realize their vision. That can happen. Sometimes it takes a really long time, but you never focus too much on where they're at when they come to you. You try to see, you see the potential in the person, and you try to help them. You try to show them what they're able to do, and push them a little bit, and that's amazing to see. There's all kinds of different profiles. There are people who are extraordinarily brilliant, creative minds who aren't primarily professional musicians.
I don't want to say amateur, maybe the amateur perspective on things. Sometimes it kind of jolts the professional mind in a very humbling way, like a fresh look on things from someone who's not just, this is not their everyday, all day.
Yeah, well, we should all aspire to be amateurs.
I think so. The word has gotten a bad rap, right?
It seems to have, yeah. It seems to have.
I mean, historically, that line isn't as bold as it is now, like amateur versus professional.
It reminds me of the argument between Feldman and Boulez. Boulez had this idea that there was such a thing as a professional composer, which there is. I mean, certainly in France, in Europe in general, there's all of the hallmarks of a professional activity are there. There's a professional status for composers. There's a special retirement fund that you pay into if you're a composer. And Feldman's whole thing was, he was the son of someone who worked in the garment district in New York, in Queens, and he viewed himself as coming from this more sort of working class / business world. So Boulez viewed Feldman and his friends, Earl Brown and Cage and Christian Wolff, those people, as amateurs, people who didn't have, the standard professional training, who didn't do professional commissions, or at least not in the earlier stages of their careers, and who wrote this music that, as he saw it, completely lacked the sort of normal composer's toolkit. So he viewed them as amateurs, and he had the same basic view of Charles Ives as well. This was, he was also an amateur. And Feldman's counter to that was that Boulez was the opposite of everything he wanted art to be. So this is, it's an old dispute. If I had to choose, I would side with Feldman, by the way.
There's more potential, maybe, less regularity.
Art is overwhelmingly a private affair in the United States. By private, I mean private sector. Whereas in Europe, since the Second World War, it's two very different visions, I think, of musical culture.
Talking briefly about your students, and when I work with passionate young musicians in conservatory situation, I see them in this sort of dreamlike state, practicing violin concertos for 8 hours a day, maybe. Concertos that I know, and maybe they know, that they will never perform, or maybe perform very few, a few times. But yet this dream state persists. And, I know it's an essential journey for kind of understanding the craft, understanding music. But then my practical adult brain also turns on. And what should the relationship to reality be for a young musician? Is there like an ideal time for that shift to happen, where you go from idealistic to, let's say, career-oriented? Feels like music schools are trying to negotiate this. And I'm wondering if that's something you've thought about.
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's made quite a lot more complicated by the fact that the profession is changing rapidly in all kinds of unpredictable ways. It's not clear to me how an institution should prepare students for that, or even if they can. So when I was a student, this was 20 years ago, the entire assumption of the institution and of the faculty was that the conditions in which they had developed their own careers would be approximately the same for the then graduating students. In other words, the sorts of possibilities that existed in the 1980s and 1990s would continue to exist, maybe not indefinitely, but at least for that generation and maybe a few generations hence. And even in 2006, when I started at the conservatory, it was obvious to me that that was not true. That the things that were possible in the 80s they were still kind of possible, but it's the kind of possible where, there was a massive impulsion that happened, in the post-war era, that was gradually losing steam. Clearly, the attitudes and the priorities that shaped those successive generations of musicians were no longer connected to any particular political will or any particular external reality. That impulse was being gradually dissipated. So it's like you can try to, desperately hang on to these breadcrumbs that are dwindling and getting farther and farther apart and try to catch them, or you can try to see if there's some other model, some other pathway forward. So I chose the latter. Saying I chose it is probably a bit grandiose because I'm giving myself too much credit. I think it was imposed on me as a matter of professional survival. That's probably more accurate. But maybe I recognized that I wasn't going to be able to depend on the institutional route in order to make my career. Well, maybe one thing you can say to students is to make them sensitive to that question, and not assume that the things that worked for preceding generations are going to work for them, because in all likelihood they won't. It's hard to answer because I'm not sure that composition is a profession. If I look at what composers are actually doing with their time and how they're actually earning their money, usually it's through teaching. And the composing is, at the top of the pyramid, and it's the thing that makes everything else possible. But they typically don't earn their living directly through it. There are some very rare exceptions to that. And it's usually people who write really large-scale pieces like orchestral works and operas and things like that, and who can get into that world. But the vast bulk of composers, I think, are mostly making a living doing something else. It's the same with poets. It's the same with photographers. Same with playwrights. Well, what you need to do is to build this scaffolding, this protective structure, this protective shell that allows you to sit in a room and do what you need to do. And if you don't have that, then your life will be a waking nightmare. It's different for different people depending on their particular strengths and their particular skill set. Some will be genius teachers, who can revolutionize a student's entire career path with a few judiciously chosen words. Others will be skilled communicators. Others will be performers. Others will be arts professionals, or they'll get into administration. And there are lots of possibilities. Or you might be one of the, 1 in 20,000 that is able to write enough commissioned works to get by. But there again, it depends hugely on what your personal circumstances are. For example, if you live alone and you don't have children, then that completely changes the game, right? Then the range of opportunities that's available to you is completely different.
Unless you employ your children to become scribes or something when they're old enough, and suddenly it becomes a plus, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's the old-fashioned approach.
Yeah, the idealist in me wants musicians to stay in the bubble as long as possible and not even have a thought about their career until, to delay that as much as possible. But I know that this is such a dangerous game to play these days.
This idea that it's either you on stage playing a Mozart concerto or nothing, and you failed, is an extraordinarily dangerous one, I believe, and it to the detriment of the entire profession. This is one of the basic problems with music education in France, incidentally, compared to Germany, which is that the professional training in France for performers is all geared towards concerto playing and being a soloist and being a virtuoso, whereas the Germans place a much more emphasis on collective music making and playing in orchestras, and it's a much healthier situation, and the music is much more sort of integrated also into the culture than is the case in France.
Part of this journey for young musicians is getting comfortable with self-promotion and all these things that have to come out of, let's say, a privately funded enterprise or one where more of an effort to make yourself known, maybe.
I have to push back on that because I don't like the term self-promotion. I don't think self-promotion works. Self-promotion implies that you're just you're trying to put yourself out and get people's attention. I don't think that works. I think that you have to learn how to communicate effectively, and you also have to figure out what you can do that might be useful, that might be of value to other people. That's not the same thing as self-promotion, though. And if you can't do those two things, then it's going to be extraordinarily difficult to get into the professional world, for sure. It's like if you can't make a strong case for yourself, and if you can't look out into the professional landscape and see opportunities, then it's not going to go very far. That's just a pragmatic reality.
At the same time, people with cats
Well,
playing violin still get more views than me. So what do I know?
you have to create value for other people ultimately, whatever way it is you're doing that. And if you're using Instagram as a kind of a funnel to draw people in and then directing them towards something valuable, then fine. I don't care. I don't care how trivial or silly or clickbaity the Instagram posts are, provided that it leads to something that's of value. One question that I very rarely see young composers, particularly the ones that primarily go through the conservatory and university system, the question I never hear them ask is, what could I bring to the world that other people aren't bringing to the world? And that, I think, is a fundamental thing if you want to be an artist, and especially if you want to make a living at it. And if you don't even ask that question, then you're just one of 30,000 composers trying to get people's attention and probably not producing anything that's particularly original or remarkable. And a lot of these people have a kind of a parasitic relationship with the institutions that exist. Like they're sucking up resources from institutions that already exist. They don't actually have their own audience, right? They have a borrowed audience that is usually a festival audience. So they don't have an organic audience. And if that artificial support were to disappear, then they would find that nobody's listening. And I don't find that to be a particularly, brilliant way of adding value to the world.
Speaking a bit about the conservatory system, and you'd already mentioned how you had your own clash with it, or your mind was elsewhere by the time you got there. Is the conservatory redeemable? What would a school look like? What would a program look like that would maybe better foster, let's say, someone like you when you were entering that system?
Well, to be clear, I had a number of really brilliant teachers who were extraordinarily helpful. So I'm not pointing any fingers whatsoever. And also, a lot of the blame rests on my shoulders for having been recalcitrant and rebarbative and stubborn. I hope there's.
But those are some of your best qualities, Samuel.
That's true. Well, they're both hindrances and qualities at the same time. Look, the thing is, artists aren't normal people. You can't get around that basic fact. It's like we're not regular, ordinary people. The great artists of the 20th century are, deeply eccentric weirdos who don't fit into boxes, right? And almost none of them had PhDs. If you look at the great composers of the 20th century, these were not sort of upstanding academic types for the most part. There are a couple of exceptions. Webern had a doctoral degree in musicology from the University of Vienna, but most of them, were just too weird to fit into those kinds of structures. And the problem that we're having, I think, right now is that as a matter of survival, a lot of artists are going into academic programs by default because they figure that's the only way they can make a living. But those institutions are not very forgiving of the very qualities that make artists what they are and make them interesting. You want situations that allow these deeply unconventional people to flourish with their particular talents, and I think that's extremely hard to do in an institutional framework. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I think it's difficult.
There is this kind of sacred teacher-student relationship from which everything comes, and I see school as kind of this structure that's built on top of that, and it's unclear if it's sometimes nurturing that relationship or hindering it, or is irrelevant to it entirely. And I'm left wondering, like, what is this? It's like the church being built on some foundational religious energy that and the church evolves over time, and then it's unclear at some point what relevance it has to the origin story anymore. And yeah, I wonder if that's a cyclical thing that we have to go back to, because I see in conservatory very often like incredible teachers that are just not really empowered by the structure.
I would advocate for a return to a master and apprentice type of situation, which worked perfectly well in the 17th century. This idea that everything has to be academicized, to coin a term, that all creative activity has to be presented under the rubric of research is patently absurd, and research in the academic sense of the term. I've often made the point that my sister, who lives in Newfoundland, Canada, is a professor of theoretical physics, and she does research. She does real research. She's a scientist. That's research. What I do isn't research in that sense. I mean, it is in a broader metaphysical sense, I suppose, but it's not academic research. And there's something fraudulent to me about forcing artists to frame their work. These sort of autoethnographies that are very common in the university world. Where you undertake a creative project of some kind and you write about it as though you were conducting research on yourself, or reflecting on your own creative practice. I think that's completely fraudulent. I think it's absurd. It's an epiphenomenon. It has to do with the fact that we can't easily figure out where to put artists, right? It's not obvious how we can extract the benefits from their particular creativity societally. It's not obvious how they should be funded or if they should be funded. And one way around that problem is to frame their work as research and turn them all into university professors. The institutions are being run like businesses for the most part, at least in the United States. And to the extent that they're successful businesses, then they're probably doing, what they're meant to do. I'm being maybe slightly cynical about that, but I think there's a grain of truth in that. I think the solution might be that maybe fewer people should go to university. And I don't think that's a particularly controversial thing to say. The percentage of adults who go into master's and doctoral programs is so much higher now than it was 50 years ago, when almost nobody had a doctoral degree, almost nobody had a master's degree. Now it's like the default. Everybody does it. And maybe that's part of it. Maybe it's like, look at some other possibilities. Maybe a doctoral degree in composition doesn't actually make any sense. This was something that Milton Babbitt wrote about quite a lot in the 1960s, and his contention was that the Americans don't have a tradition of noble patronage. That's not what Americans are, right? So in order to provide a bulwark against the pressures of the commercial marketplace, the best place for composers to go was the Ivy Leagues. Where they would be shielded from having to earn a living from their work. Now that seems to me like a terrible, terrible mistake. If you look at the history of opera, for example, opera has always been filthy with compromise, with commercial pressures. It's like it's an expensive, complicated medium. Somebody has to fund it. And composers, if they wanted to succeed in that world, they had to contend with those problems. And of course, it directed to a degree the sorts of projects that they would do. The idea that commercial pressures are something that we have to be shielded from, I think, is hugely problematic, especially if you consider the relationship between artists and finance, and how they manage to survive over the centuries. You could say, well, commercial pressures artificially distort the priorities of musicians, because then all they're going to think about is how they can make a buck. But that's such a reductive view of the situation. Like, they can also provide a positive incentive. It's simpler to believe that, if we just had enough public money, if there were just enough granting programs, if there were just enough private foundations, then, everybody could take 6 months off and write their masterpiece. And I just don't see things that way.
One of the keys of surviving these days and thriving as an artist is like to be able to justify what you do verbally and to communicate it, and have no assumption that someone will take up your cause, like whether it's a manager or a nobleman or whatever insulating structure. I
think there is an epidemic of entitlement, which leads people to believe that they they deserve to be funded, no matter what they're doing, no matter how few people might be interested in it. And I'm not saying that out of any kind of cruelty. Once again, to be clear, I want artists to thrive and survive and be able to powerfully project their visions and attract the audiences that they want. And, or even if maybe if they're not particularly interested in audiences, at least to have that protective sphere around them that allows them to do their work without, being terrified of the whole thing coming crashing down at every second. But I think the idea that you should just be able to plug into these structures and just derive your sustenance from it without ever actually, to use that vulgar term again, but without ever actually shipping a product, without ever actually producing something that comes to broader public attention, or that is marketable or saleable, or that has any particular resonance beyond your immediate circle of concern. I think that's it's simply not realistic. It might be that we've done a bad job of explaining that to artists. So an example that I've often cited is the instance of Vivian Maier, who is an American photographer from Chicago.
One of my favorites.
Yeah, right. She was one of the great street photographers. And as you know, she was a nanny for her entire life. That was her profession. Nobody ever saw her photographs. I don't think she even had them developed most of the time. So when she died, archivists discovered tens of thousands of negatives.
I think they're still being uploaded.
They're still being uploaded. That's right. Yeah. But she was one of the great photographers of the 20th century, and no pretensions whatsoever to having any kind of a professional career. It was an activity that was obviously extremely important to her, and she was very devoted to it, took it seriously, and got better at it over the years. And look, there are people who are in that sort of situation where it's something they have to do. They have no professional pretensions whatsoever. They make a living doing something else, and that's fine.
Well, maybe that's a good segue into just talking a bit about the state of classical music, maybe past, present, future. I've heard you talk about kind of the social cohesion and the shared language that by which we understand music. Do you feel like there's a lack of a unified criteria in assessing, let's say, contemporary music? And is that to blame for, let's say, having 3 people in your audience? Is it just because people don't have the language to assess the music in a cohesive way?
Well, we'd have to look at some specific cases because it varies quite a lot depending on the artist. I don't think Philip Glass has that problem, for example. But it partly depends on what you're aiming for. And again, if your circle of concern extends no farther than the tip of your nose, then you shouldn't be surprised when only 3 people are interested. And maybe 3 is being generous.
Mom,
it depends.
Dad.
Right.
You need one more.
You need one more. Yeah. That's right. Well,
what about with
too, right?
That's right. I mean, how much explaining do you feel you have to do with your music? Do you feel the compulsion to kind of add program notes, as it were, to be impactful to the average person?
My credo is explain nothing. I don't typically talk about my own work on my YouTube channel. And I don't have anything particularly insightful to say about it either. I think the work has to stand or fall on its merits. And feeling that you need to write an article every time you make a piece in order to explain it to people, I think is very strange. It would be strange in any other art form, but somehow it's become the norm in composition. I don't get that. I'm one of the few people that really doesn't get the whole program note thing. It's symptomatic of a broader problem. Music and the arts generally used to have a powerful symbolic framework that was broadly shared by the people in a community, and it spoke that way, and when that starts to degrade, let's say, or when creative practices turn into these sort of quirky expressions of individuality, but without necessarily going much beyond that, then I suppose program notes are necessary so that your audience can understand, what's so special about you and this kind of thing. But I don't find that to be a particularly ennobling or exalted destination for an artist.
From your perspective, when you're creating a piece of music, are you consciously thinking that that you need to have one foot in the door of what people might expect, and then you're going to take that expectation elsewhere, or, framing your expression in a way that isn't simply like a quirk, not giving people an access point, perhaps.
I think great composers are able to powerfully communicate with people. I don't know any exceptions to that. And their ideas resonate powerfully through unconscious means. That's what they're tapping into. And the unconscious is also the domain of the symbolic. And you want to tap into those things. They're the sources of the greatest power that you can access as a human being. So maybe seeking to set yourself apart isn't necessarily the optimal strategy, though. Maybe that's part of the problem. Like, do you think that Vivaldi was trying to set himself apart? I love the Vivaldi concertos. I listen to them all the time. Some are more interesting than others. There's
Yeah.
nothing particularly novel about them. You can find that that a similar style in many other Italian composers of that era. And I don't think he was sitting there tearing his hair out, thinking, "My God, I've got to find some little quirk that."
Well, I
No,
think
I
the
think
Quattro Stagioni are pretty quirky, but maybe not intentionally. Although he does instruct
yeah,
people to act drunk in one. That's
yeah, right. No, it is also a sea of noise, as we mentioned earlier in our discussion. The barrier to publication is basically removed now, so the floodgates are open, and anybody can publish their work, which has some positive consequences and also obviously some negative ones. And maybe that also pushes people to try to rely upon the quirks of their personality more than they might have done otherwise. I don't know.
well, it seems like when the floodgates are open, it would necessitate even more sort of guidance for the average listener. So you'd think that the role of the music critic now becomes more important because, how do people know what's good or what's bad? And it seems like, at least from my perspective, I see the opposite. Like the music critic is kind of, it's not even a thing anymore. It's kind of hanging on to some historical value and, doing a Substack and like actually writing something of value is more interesting to people in general.
Oh, the algorithm helps with that. The algorithm is the ultimate music critic. The critics themselves
Indeed.
have become completely irrelevant because they can't compete with that. They can't compete with this massively complex, incomprehensibly complex system that is very good at delivering things that are in line with your tastes while simultaneously slightly nudging them in this direction or that direction. So who needs critics anymore? Yeah.
I love David Horowitz's videos. It's some funny stuff.
Well, a lot of yeah, there are people on YouTube who are doing a good job, I think, of creating things that are personable and that can coalesce a community around their videos also, and that's been quite interesting to see.
When the whole online thing was getting started, there was this idea of, you need to get a million followers or like millions of views, and that's kind of the goal. And that I think has shifted more towards, no, you need like 1,000 people to give you $10 a month, let's say, if you're going down that route, and you need people who are very engaged with your work and willing to be, to be there with you. Have either of those strategies shaped kind of your activities online and offline?
Not really. My channel has the peculiarity that it really doesn't generate any revenue. Probably my viewer numbers aren't high enough for that. So I'm at 61,000 subscribers right now, which is, it's not huge by YouTube standards. Like nobody's going to confuse me with Mr. Beast anytime soon.
That's a
But
collab that you should do.
yeah, right, yeah, yeah. Why hasn't he called me yet?
100
But the
composers fighting it to the death. Okay, I already have so many
right,
ideas.
yeah, 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 definitely. But the impact that the channel has had on me personally, and but also on a lot of other people, has been completely disproportionate to the number of people who are actually watching, which has been interesting to see. So, for example, it's allowed me to make a living. It's resolved the problem that I had to deal with for like 20 years, which was that I never had any income. I was always it was hand to mouth. It was very difficult, and I'm by no means, I'm not making a lot of money, but I'm doing a lot better than I was. And that's basically thanks to the YouTube channel. So that's transformed my life for sure, like completely. It's put me into contact with some extraordinarily unlikely people, to say the least. And it's taken me all over the world. And that just keeps going and going and going. And again, in absolute terms, the channel generates like some ridiculous, like $100 a month or something in ad revenue. And so that's, obviously that doesn't matter, but the knock-on effects, if you like, have been profound. I had a Belgian photographer on the show about 6 months ago, an old friend of mine, and my channel isn't about photography. And the interview was in French, and most of my viewers are Anglophone. So it's like, yeah, nobody's going to watch it. I know. Like, it's going to have a really small viewership. But if I didn't do that interview with him, nobody else was going to do it. And I thought it was important to do. And he had lots of interesting insights about creativity. And not that many people watched it. But the people who did watch it and watched it all the way through really loved that interview. And it's going to be still there in 20 years in all likelihood. And so, yeah, I lost money doing that. I lose money on a lot of my videos.
I guess it depends on the time frame you measure it by, because I think that kind of content, there's certain videos that I want to make that I know just won't get as many views, but like I feel compelled to make them. I think they're valuable, et cetera, et cetera.
Like this one.
Well, you'll just wait till you see how I edit it.
Oh no. Oh no. Samuel Andreyev reveals all. A shocking
That's right.
interview.
That's right. I think on a long enough time frame, those videos attract fewer people, but higher impact people, perhaps.
The people that, like, not very many people bought the first Velvet Underground album, but the old line is that everybody who did buy it started their own rock band. And that's a particular kind of success that is distinct from, being a million selling artist.
I think it's more. I think it's more valuable, and I think you could probably make a decent living, without selling out Madison Square Garden. Plus, I think the kind of people that want to sell out Madison Square Garden, if you gave them Madison Square Garden, they wouldn't know what to do with it.
Yeah, that's true.
That's like everyone should have that, just to see that this is not. This dream comes from somewhere else, maybe. Well, speaking of things that on your channel that I like that maybe won't get a million views, is Rafael Toral's Spectral Evolution the piece that Pink Floyd always wanted to write?
He's better than Pink Floyd. Pink Floyd were a hugely successful music corporation. What's interesting is that none of them were individually particularly strong as musicians, and yet they managed to create this phenomenon, this global phenomenon. It's fascinating, actually, how they did
like
that.
Every great chamber orchestra.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. It's quite interesting to see how they did that, especially when you look at the few albums that they released after the departure of Syd Barrett, where they had no direction. It was completely experimental. They didn't know what they were doing in the best sense of the word. That's my favorite era of their production, is when they were just willing to try anything. And they did some really bizarre things during that period. And then when Dark Side of the Moon happened, and they achieved this global success, it destroyed the band very quickly. But Rafael Toral is, I think, an extremely interesting character. And when I heard Spectral Evolution, I was blown away. I was really impressed by it. And this is the sort of thing I'd like to see more of, and he's a one-off in a sense. There aren't too many people producing work in the way that he does and attracting large audiences, and more power to him, and that doesn't fit any kind of archetype of what composers are supposed to look like. But there you have it. And that's why, I would point students in that direction and say, look, there are other things that are possible.
What works of yours do you think would be a kind of a good introduction into your kind of compositional identity, and maybe what are you working on right now?
Well, I spent most of this year writing chamber pieces, including a large piece for solo cello that took quite a few months to write, and a couple of pieces for solo violin. So this has been my string year, and then I've got a string quartet I'm going to be doing relatively soon. And I wrote a vocal duo, which is my most recent piece. In terms of directing people to the recordings that are available commercially, I would start with the most recent one, which is a double album called In Glow of Like Seclusion. and that's out from Divine Art Records in the UK. And that's my most recent full-length album, and I think it's an ideal introduction to my work.
Samuel, thanks very much for making the time, and it's been a pleasure to talk with you and to get to know your ideas and your music a bit better.
Likewise. We'll do it again real soon, and thank you for the invitation.